The cruelest betrayals are never written by strangers. They are signed by the people who once promised you home. Before the first hint of dawn reached the pine-covered mountains of Ash Hollow Pack, Evelyn Carter stood silently beside the weathered trading post, her wrists free but her future already stolen. A cold breeze carried the scent of damp earth and cedar through the valley as wagons waited with their lanterns glowing like distant stars. She searched the quiet streets one last time, hoping someone would step forward and tell her this had all been a terrible mistake. No one did. Behind her, Nathan Carter pressed his name into a faded contract with a steady hand that never once trembled. He never looked at his younger sister. The gold resting on the wooden table reflected in his eyes far brighter than the tears she refused to let fall. Their pack had struggled through years of failed harvests, broken alliances, and endless fear. But Evelyn knew this payment was never about survival. Nathan had always wanted more than safety. He wanted status, influence, and a seat beside powerful wolves who had never respected him. Selling his own sister to the neighboring Blackwood pack had become the easiest bargain he had ever made. Evelyn finally found her voice, soft enough that only he could hear. "Was I ever your family?" Nathan paused for barely a heartbeat before turning away. "You were the only thing I had left to trade." His words settled over the valley with a weight heavier than stone. The guards from Blackwood approached without cruelty, simply carrying out the agreement they had been ordered to fulfill. One older soldier offered Evelyn a warm cloak against the morning chill before helping her into the waiting wagon. The unexpected kindness almost hurt more than the betrayal itself. As the horses began their slow climb along the mountain road, Evelyn watched Ash Hollow disappear behind layers of gray mist until even the rooftops vanished from sight. She wrapped the cloak tighter around her shoulders and whispered a quiet goodbye that no one could hear. Miles away, beyond forests stretching farther than the eye could follow, Alpha King Adrian Blackwood woke. Suddenly before sunrise, his breathing uneven. Once again he had seen the same face. Gentle amber eyes. Dark chestnut hair moving in the wind. A young woman reaching toward him beneath silver moonlight before fading into the distance just as he called after her. The dream had haunted him for years, always ending before he could learn her name. He sat beside the palace window, staring toward the eastern horizon as an unfamiliar ache settled inside his chest. Without knowing why, he whispered into the silent room, "I'm coming." Neither the king nor the frightened young woman traveling toward his kingdom could have imagined that destiny had already begun moving long before either of them took their first breath. The journey to Blackwood Pack lasted 2 long days, winding through towering pines and valleys wrapped in pale morning fog. Evelyn Carter barely spoke as the wagon rolled over rough stone roads, each passing mile carrying her farther from the only home she had ever known. The soldiers assigned to escort her remained respectful, offering fresh water whenever they stopped and sharing simple meals beside quiet streams. Their unexpected courtesy only deepened the mystery. If she had truly been sold as nothing more than property, why did no one treat her that way? Late on the second afternoon, the forest opened to reveal Blackwood Citadel standing high above the cliffs. Massive stone walls stretched across the mountainside, crowned by silver banners that danced in the wind. The castle looked less like a fortress built for war, and more like an ancient promise carved into the earth itself. Evelyn could not look away. She had heard countless stories describing the enemy pack as ruthless monsters, yet nothing before her matched those fearful tales. Merchants walked safely through the gates. Children chased one another across the market square. Families gathered beneath flowering trees that lined the wide streets leading toward the palace. Everything felt strangely peaceful. The wagon finally stopped before the great entrance where rows of royal guards stood in perfect silence. The captain stepped down first before offering Evelyn his hand. She accepted it, carefully smoothing the wrinkles from her simple dress as dozens of curious eyes followed her every movement. Somewhere beyond the towering doors, footsteps echoed across polished marble. Every conversation stopped. Every guard straightened. Alpha King Adrian Blackwood entered the grand hall without a single announcement. He wore a dark coat embroidered with silver thread, his calm expression revealing almost nothing as he descended the broad staircase. Confidence surrounded him as naturally as breathing. He acknowledged his advisors with quiet nods before his attention shifted toward the young woman waiting near the entrance. Time seemed to lose its meaning. Adrian stopped halfway down the stairs. His heartbeat quickened with a feeling he had never experienced while awake. Those amber eyes. That gentle expression. The same face that had appeared in every dream since he was a lonely boy standing beneath unfamiliar stars. Could not be possible. Yet there she stood only a few yards away, real enough to steal every prepared thought from his mind. Evelyn lowered her gaze respectfully, unaware that the entire room had fallen into uneasy silence. She expected the feared ruler to dismiss her with indifference. Instead, nothing happened. The king simply stared as though searching through years that neither of them remembered. An elderly advisor quietly cleared his throat. Adrian finally drew a slow breath, forcing every emotion back behind the composed mask his court expected. "Welcome to Blackwood," he said, his voice calm despite the storm rising within him. "You have traveled far. You will be given a comfortable room and everything necessary for your stay." Confusion flickered across the faces of the nobles lining the hall. They had expected a political transaction, not kindness. Evelyn looked up for only an instant, surprised by the warmth hidden beneath his measured words. Before either of them could speak again, a young noblewoman stepped forward with a graceful smile that never reached her eyes. "Your Majesty," she said sweetly, "surely an outsider should first prove where her loyalties belong." Adrian turned toward the speaker without raising his voice. "Every guest under my roof deserves dignity until they choose otherwise." The answer was simple, yet it ended every whispered objection. As attendants escorted Evelyn through long corridors filled with sunlight pouring across polished stone floors, she glanced back one final time. Adrian remained standing exactly where she had left him, watching the empty doorway with an expression no one in the kingdom had ever seen before. That night he stood alone on the palace balcony beneath a sky filled with brilliant stars. For years his dreams had ended the moment the mysterious young woman reached toward him. Tonight, for the first time, the dream had continued after he awakened. Somewhere inside the palace, she was finally real, and the impossible feeling that had followed him through countless restless nights had only grown stronger. Sleep refused to visit either of them that night. Evelyn Carter stood beside the narrow window of the quiet guest chamber overlooking the moonlit gardens below, listening to the gentle sound of fountains carried through the cool mountain air. Everything about Blackwood Citadel felt unfamiliar, yet nothing felt threatening. A maid had brought her warm tea, fresh bread, and a simple blue dress before wishing her peaceful dreams with genuine kindness. The contrast left Evelyn more unsettled than fear ever could. She had prepared herself to become an unwanted prisoner. Instead, she had been welcomed as though her comfort mattered. Across the palace, Alpha King Adrian Blackwood remained awake inside the royal library where hundreds of leather-bound journals lined towering shelves. He unlocked a small cedar chest hidden behind an old map and carefully lifted a weathered notebook whose pages had yellowed with time. The first entry had been written when he was only 12 years old. Every page held the same impossible story. A girl with amber eyes, dark chestnut hair moving beneath silver moonlight. A smile that appeared only for a heartbeat before fading with the sunrise. Year after year he had sketched the same face, believing it to be nothing more than a strange dream sent by an overactive imagination. Yet every drawing looked astonishingly similar to the young woman who had arrived that afternoon. Adrian slowly turned another page until he reached the newest sketch completed only 3 nights earlier. His fingers tightened around the paper as disbelief settled over him once again. There was no difference between the drawing and Evelyn. The curve of her smile, the quiet sadness resting inside her eyes. Even the tiny strand of hair that always slipped across the right side of her face had somehow appeared in every dream. He closed the journal and whispered to the empty room, "Who are you?" At that same moment, Evelyn finally drifted into a restless sleep. She found herself standing in an endless meadow covered with silver flowers that shimmered beneath a full moon. The air smelled of cedar and fresh rain. Somewhere nearby, footsteps crossed the soft grass. She turned slowly, sensing someone familiar even though she had never been there before. A tall figure stood beneath an ancient oak tree, his face hidden by pale mist while moonlight rested upon his shoulders. She could not see his features, yet her heart recognized a presence that felt strangely comforting. He reached toward her without speaking. Just before their hands could touch, the wind scattered thousands of glowing flower petals between them, and the dream dissolved into morning light. Evelyn awoke with her heartbeat racing, unable to explain the overwhelming feeling of loss lingering inside her chest. She pressed one hand against the cool window glass as dawn painted the mountains gold. Somewhere else inside the palace, Adrian opened his balcony doors at the exact same moment, staring toward the eastern horizon with the same unanswered question echoing through his mind. Neither of them realized they had shared fragments of the same dream for the very first time. As breakfast was served in the royal dining hall, whispers spread quietly among the nobles. Lady Vivian Ashcroft watched Evelyn from across the room, hiding her growing frustration behind a graceful smile. She had expected the outsider to disappear quietly into the background, yet the king had asked twice whether their guest had rested well. Adrian had never asked such a question about anyone before. Vivian folded her hands calmly, but a quiet determination settled behind her pleasant expression. If the mysterious young woman had somehow captured the king's attention, then discovering the reason would become her highest priority. Unaware of the silent eyes following her every step, Evelyn accepted a cup of tea from one of the servants and thanked him with a warm smile. The servant smiled back before hurrying away, while several members of the royal court exchanged puzzled glances. Small acts of kindness often revealed more about a person's heart than grand speeches ever could, and without realizing it, Evelyn had already begun changing the atmosphere inside a palace that had long forgotten what simple warmth felt like. The days that followed settled into an uneasy rhythm that no one inside Blackwood Citadel could quite explain. Evelyn Carter remained a guest by royal decree, yet many members of the court refused to see her as anything more than a reminder of an old rivalry between neighboring packs. Conversations grew quieter whenever she entered a room. Polite smiles disappeared the moment she looked away. She answered every cold glance with quiet dignity, choosing kindness over resentment because it was the only strength no one had ever been able to take from her. Each morning she wandered through the palace gardens where white roses climbed along ancient stone walls and small birds gathered beside clear fountains. She often stopped to help elderly gardeners carry baskets of fresh herbs or collect fallen branches after the mountain winds swept through the grounds. None of those tasks had been expected of her. She simply noticed people who needed an extra pair of hands. The workers soon greeted her with genuine smiles, though they always looked around nervously before speaking, afraid the nobles might misunderstand their friendliness. From the upper balcony overlooking the gardens, Adrian Blackwood watched more than he intended. He had originally stepped outside to review reports from neighboring territories, yet his attention drifted again and again toward the young woman below. She never sought attention. She never complained. Even after everything she had lost, she still thanked every servant by name and smiled as though hope had not abandoned her. It was the same quiet warmth that surrounded the mysterious girl in every dream he had carried since childhood. His closest advisor, Theodore Hawthorne, quietly approached beside him. "Your Majesty," the older man said gently, "the council has begun asking questions." Adrian kept his eyes on the garden. "About what?" Theodore hesitated before answering. "About why the guest from Ash Hollow receives consideration that no outsider has ever been given." Adrian finally looked toward him. "Has she broken any law?" "No." "Has she shown disrespect?" "Never." Adrian nodded once. "Then there is nothing more to discuss." The answer spread through the palace before sunset, but instead of ending the whispers, it only fueled them. Lady Vivian Ashcroft listened carefully as several noblewomen exchanged theories during afternoon tea. Some believed the king intended to use Evelyn for political leverage. Others claimed he pitted her circumstances. None dared imagine the truth because even Adrian himself could not explain it. Vivian stirred her tea slowly before rising with effortless grace. If questions could not reveal the stranger's secret, observation would. The following afternoon, the Royal Library hosted a gathering where scholars presented rare historical maps collected from every kingdom across the Northern Territories. Evelyn received an invitation along with the other palace guests. She entered quietly, admiring shelves that stretched nearly 30 feet toward the painted ceiling. Books had always fascinated her, even though few had been available in Ash Hollow. While the nobles discussed ancient treaties, she wandered toward a forgotten corner where several worn volumes had slipped from a neglected shelf. Without hesitation she knelt to gather them carefully, brushing away years of dust before placing them neatly back in order. An elderly librarian noticed the simple gesture and smiled with grateful surprise. "Most visitors never see that corner," he said softly. Evelyn returned the smile. Every story deserves to be remembered. Unknown to her, Adrian had entered the library only moments earlier. He had witnessed the exchange from across the room without interrupting it. The old librarian had served the royal family for more than 40 years, and few members of the court had ever spoken to him beyond formal necessity. Yet the young woman everyone treated as an outsider had offered respect without expecting anything in return. Adrian felt that familiar ache return to his chest, stronger than before. At the opposite end of the library, Vivian watched the king watching Evelyn. Her pleasant smile remained perfectly composed, but deep inside she realized something had begun changing inside the heart of a ruler who had spent years keeping every emotion carefully locked away. 3 mornings later, the royal courtyard filled with merchants, scholars, and visiting leaders arriving for the annual summit of the Northern Pax. Long tables displayed handcrafted gifts, fresh harvests, and ancient relics exchanged as symbols of peace rather than conquest. Evelyn Carter remained near the edge of the gathering, helping attendants arrange flower baskets around the central fountain. She preferred working quietly to standing among nobles who still measured her worth by the place she had come from. Adrian Blackwood greeted each delegation with calm authority, his silver eyes missing very little despite the constant conversation surrounding him. Every few moments his attention drifted almost unconsciously toward the far side of the courtyard, where Evelyn laughed softly after a small child accidentally dropped a basket of white lilies. Instead of showing frustration, she knelt beside the little girl and patiently gathered every flower, returning the basket with the same gentle smile that had begun changing even the palace servants. Nearby, Lady Vivian Ashcroft noticed the king's wandering attention once again. She exchanged a brief glance with another noble before quietly stepping toward the fountain where Evelyn continued arranging the flowers. "You seem quite comfortable here," Vivian said with flawless courtesy. Evelyn looked up and offered a respectful smile. "Everyone has been kinder than I expected." "Not everyone," Vivian replied gently, her words carrying a meaning hidden beneath their pleasant tone. Before Evelyn could answer, a sudden gust swept through the open courtyard. Decorative banners snapped sharply overhead as one of the heavy ceremonial lanterns hanging above the stone archway shifted unexpectedly against its iron chain. Several guests stepped back in surprise after hearing the strained metal creak above them. Adrian immediately looked toward the sound. Time seemed to slow. The chain finally gave way, and the large lantern began falling directly toward the path where an elderly ambassador had frozen in confusion beneath the arch. Without thinking, Evelyn hurried forward, calling out for him to move. The startled ambassador turned just in time to step aside while the lantern struck the stone walkway only a few feet away, shattering harmlessly across the empty space he had occupied moments earlier. The courtyard fell silent. Evelyn remained standing beside the shaken visitor, her breathing quick but steady. Adrian crossed the distance almost immediately, not with panic but with unmistakable concern. "Are you hurt?" he asked quietly. Evelyn looked surprised by the question. "I am all right, Your Majesty. Please check on him first." She nodded toward the elderly ambassador, whose hand still trembled from the unexpected scare. Adrian studied her for a long moment before turning to ensure the visitor was unharmed. As relief spread through the gathering, the old ambassador reached for Evelyn's hands with grateful eyes. "You thought of someone else before yourself," he said warmly. "That is a rare gift." The moment his weathered fingers rested against hers, a strange warmth flowed through the air. Evelyn blinked as a vivid image flashed across her mind. She saw a young boy standing alone beneath an enormous oak tree surrounded by silver flowers glowing beneath the moon. He looked no older than 10, his silver eyes filled with loneliness as though he had been waiting for someone he could not remember. At that exact instant, Adrian staggered almost imperceptibly as the same memory swept through him. Except this time the dream had changed. Across the meadow stood a little girl with dark chestnut hair holding a crown of white blossoms. She smiled before reaching toward him exactly as she had in every dream, but now he heard her voice for the first time. "Do not be afraid. I will find you." The vision disappeared as suddenly as it had arrived. Neither of them spoke. Across the courtyard, they met each other's eyes with quiet disbelief, both recognizing something that no words could explain. Hidden among the watching nobles, Theodore Hawthorne saw the silent exchange and felt a chill settle across his heart. After decades spent studying forgotten legends, He feared the oldest prophecy in Blackwood history might no longer belong to ancient stories. It might have just awakened before everyone without a single soul realizing what had truly begun. That evening an unusual silence settled over Blackwood Citadel. The cheerful conversations that had filled the courtyard during the summit faded into whispers carried through long stone hallways lit by golden lanterns. Adrian Blackwood remained alone inside the oldest chamber of the royal archives, standing before a circular table covered with faded scrolls and forgotten maps. Across from him, Theodore Hawthorne carefully unlocked an ancient wooden chest that had remained sealed for generations. Dust floated through the candlelight as he removed a thick manuscript wrapped in silver cloth. "I prayed I would never need to open this again," the old advisor said quietly. Adrian looked toward the worn pages without speaking. Theodore unfolded the fragile manuscript with steady hands and revealed a detailed illustration of an ancient oak tree surrounded by silver flowers beneath a full moon. Adrian felt his breath catch. It was the same place from every dream. The same meadow. The same tree. Theodore turned another page, revealing words written centuries earlier by the first royal historian of Blackwood. "When the moon chooses balance over power, the future Alpha King shall dream of one face long before fate allows them to meet. He shall know neither her name nor her homeland, only the light carried within her heart. When they finally stand beneath the same sky, forgotten memories shall awaken, and the path prepared before birth shall begin to reveal itself." The room became perfectly still. Adrian slowly lowered his eyes to the page again. "This is impossible." Theodore gave a gentle smile filled with both relief and concern. "Many believed it was only a legend. Yet today you recognize someone you had never met, and she experienced the same vision at the very same moment. Legends often survive because someone once witnessed the truth." Adrian walked toward the balcony overlooking the sleeping kingdom below. Countless lanterns glowed throughout the city while distant mountains disappeared beneath silver moonlight. He had spent years believing the dreams were nothing more than restless imagination. Now every impossible memory suddenly carried meaning. Meanwhile, Evelyn sat alone in the palace greenhouse surrounded by blooming white orchids and climbing ivy. The quiet warmth inside the glass walls reminded her of peaceful mornings from childhood before life had become complicated. She closed her eyes, trying to remember the little boy from the vision. His lonely silver eyes lingered inside her thoughts with surprising clarity. "Why do I feel like I have always known you?" she whispered to the empty room. An elderly woman tending the flowers nearby looked up with a gentle expression. Her name was Miriam, the palace gardener who had cared for the royal grounds for nearly 50 years. She smiled kindly at Evelyn before placing another flowering vine into its stone planter. "Sometimes the heart remembers what the mind has forgotten," she said softly. Evelyn looked at her with quiet curiosity. "Have you ever felt that way?" Miriam nodded while brushing soil from her hands. "Once. I met my late husband when I was 17. The moment I saw him, I felt less like I was meeting a stranger and more like I was finally recognizing someone I had been searching for my whole life." Evelyn smiled faintly, comforted by the simple honesty of the story. She did not realize that Theodore had quietly entered the greenhouse moments earlier. He remained unseen near the doorway, carefully observing the young woman who had unknowingly become the center of an ancient prophecy. There was no pride in her posture, no ambition in her words, only quiet compassion offered freely to everyone she met. The old advisor finally understood why the forgotten writings had never described beauty, wealth, or strength when speaking of the chosen Luna. They had spoken only of a heart capable of bringing peace where fear had lived for generations. As midnight approached, Adrian opened the weather journal that had followed him since childhood and placed it beside the ancient manuscript. For the first time, the drawings, the dreams, and the prophecy no longer stood apart as separate mysteries. They had become one story. Yet before he could decide what to do next, a royal messenger hurried toward the archives carrying a sealed letter marked with the crest of Ash Hollow Pack. The message had arrived under urgent request, and the name signed at the bottom caused Adrian's calm expression to disappear. Nathan Carter was asking for permission to enter Blackwood Citadel. Nathan Carter arrived at Blackwood Citadel just after sunrise dressed in expensive traveling clothes that had been carefully chosen to impress the royal court. His posture carried the confidence of a man expecting gratitude rather than judgment. During the journey he had convinced himself that selling Evelyn had secured an important alliance, and he believed the Alpha King would reward such practical loyalty with land, influence, or perhaps even a position within the kingdom. The towering palace gates opened without delay, and royal guards escorted him through marble corridors lined with silver banners until he reached the grand audience hall. Musicians quietly stopped playing as the heavy doors swung open. Nobles gathered along both sides of the chamber, their curious eyes following every step Nathan took across the polished floor. At the far end of the hall, Adrian Blackwood sat upon the ancient stone throne carved with the symbols of generations past. His expression remained calm, revealing nothing of the thoughts hidden behind his silver eyes. Theodore Hawthorne stood nearby while Lady Vivian Ashcroft observed silently from the front row of the court. Nathan lowered himself into a respectful bow before speaking with practiced confidence. "Your Majesty, I have come to strengthen the friendship between our packs. I trust my sister has served her purpose well." The words echoed through the chamber before disappearing into complete silence. Adrian studied him for several long moments without answering. The quiet itself became heavy enough that several nobles exchanged uncertain glances. Finally the king rose from the throne and descended the wide staircase one measured step at a time. "Bring Evelyn Carter," he said simply. A servant hurried from the hall, returning moments later with Evelyn, who paused in surprise after seeing her brother standing only a few yards away. Nathan offered a satisfied smile as though expecting relief or gratitude. Instead, Evelyn remained still, her hands folded quietly before her. The distance between them felt greater than all the miles she had traveled from Ash Hollow. Nathan broke the silence first. "You look well. I knew everything would work out." Evelyn searched his face, hoping to find even the smallest trace of regret. She found none. "Did you ever wonder whether I wanted my own future?" she asked softly. Nathan shifted uncomfortably before forcing another smile. "I made the only sensible choice. One sacrifice saved us both." Adrian continued walking until he stood beside Evelyn rather than across from her. The movement alone caused whispers to ripple through the court. He looked toward Nathan with the same steady composure that had earned the respect of every leader in the Northern Territories. "In Blackwood," Adrian said, "people are never measured by what they can be traded for." Nathan blinked in confusion. "Your Majesty, I believe this arrangement benefited everyone." Adrian turned briefly toward Evelyn before speaking again. "Did she agree to this arrangement?" Nathan hesitated. She did not understand what was necessary. The answer settled over the hall like cold winter air. Adrian looked back at the assembled nobles so every voice in the room could hear his next words clearly. "Then understand ours. No person who enters this kingdom under my protection will ever be treated as property." Every conversation stopped. Even the palace servants stood motionless. Nathan felt the confidence drain from his expression as the meaning of those words became painfully clear. Adrian then did something no one inside Blackwood Citadel expected. He turned fully toward Evelyn and lowered himself onto one knee before her, not as a ruler surrendering authority but as a man honoring another person's dignity before the entire court. Gasps spread across the chamber. Theodore quietly closed his eyes, recognizing the ancient gesture described within the forgotten prophecy. Adrian lifted his gaze to meet Evelyn's with complete sincerity. "You arrived here believing you had been abandoned," he said gently. "As long as you remain beneath this roof, no one will decide your worth except you." Tears gathered in Evelyn's eyes before she could stop them. Around them the royal court stood frozen, witnessing a moment that would be remembered long after every title and every rivalry had faded into history. Nathan stared in stunned silence as he realized the sister he had exchanged for personal ambition had become the one person the Alpha King himself had chosen to honor before an entire kingdom. The silence that followed Adrian Blackwood's words lingered long after the royal audience ended. One by one the nobles quietly departed the grand hall, carrying with them a story that would spread through every corner of the kingdom before nightfall. Nathan Carter remained standing alone beneath the towering stone pillars, unable to understand how the future he had imagined had disappeared so completely. He had expected praise for strengthening an alliance. Instead, he had watched the most powerful ruler in the Northern Territories honor the very sister he had treated as a bargain. Later that afternoon, Theodore Hawthorne invited Nathan into a smaller council chamber, where sunlight streamed through stained glass windows painted with the history of Blackwood. Adrian stood beside the long oak table, his calm expression unchanged. Evelyn remained near the doorway, uncertain why she had also been asked to attend. Theodore carefully placed a weathered wooden box onto the table before opening it with deliberate care. Inside rested several faded letters tied together with a silver ribbon, and an old family medallion engraved with a crescent moon surrounded by wildflowers. Evelyn stared at the medallion with quiet surprise. "My mother owned one just like this," she whispered. Theodore nodded gently. "Because it belonged to her family." He unfolded the oldest letter and looked toward Nathan. "There is something you were never told." Nathan frowned in confusion. Theodore continued. "Many years ago, before either of you were born, your parents sheltered a traveling historian from Blackwood during a terrible winter storm. Before he departed, he entrusted your mother with these records, asking her to protect them until the proper time." Adrian listened silently while Theodore handed the first letter to Evelyn. Written in elegant handwriting was a single sentence that immediately caught her breath. "If the child born beneath the silver moon carries a heart that chooses compassion before pride, destiny itself will one day guide her home." Evelyn slowly lowered the page, unable to speak. Nathan looked between the letter and his sister with growing disbelief. "Home?" he asked. Theodore answered quietly. "Not a place. A purpose." Another letter described an ancient prophecy almost identical to the manuscript Adrian had discovered the night before. It spoke of a future Luna whose greatest strength would never be power, wealth, or noble blood, but the quiet ability to heal divisions wherever she walked. Theodore carefully folded the letter before meeting Nathan's eyes. "Your parents believed Evelyn deserved the freedom to choose her own path when the time arrived. They never intended for anyone else to make that decision for her." Nathan felt the weight of those words settle over him. Memories he had buried for years slowly returned. He remembered overhearing his parents speaking in hushed voices after Evelyn had fallen asleep beside the fireplace. He remembered his father placing the silver medallion around their mother's neck, while promising that one day Evelyn would understand why she was different. After their parents passed away, Nathan had discovered the letters hidden beneath loose floorboards. Fear and jealousy had quietly grown inside him ever since. Every sentence praised Evelyn's gentle heart, while expecting nothing special from him. He had convinced himself that destiny had unfairly chosen his younger sister. Selling her had been his way of escaping a future that constantly reminded him of his own bitterness. Nathan lowered his head, unable to meet Evelyn's eyes. "I told myself I was protecting our future," he admitted softly. "The truth is that I could not bear the thought that someone believed you were meant for something greater than I was." Evelyn stood motionless, the confession bringing sadness rather than satisfaction. Adrian finally stepped forward, his voice calm but unwavering. "Envy often begins where gratitude disappears." Nathan closed his eyes as quiet tears finally broke through years of pride. "I cannot change what I have done." "No," Adrian replied gently. "But every person chooses what kind of heart they carry from this day forward." Evelyn slowly approached her brother until only a few feet separated them. She did not reach for the letters or the medallion. Instead, she simply said, "I hope one day you become the brother I spent my childhood believing you already were." Nathan could not answer. For the first time since arriving at Blackwood, he understood that the greatest treasure he had ever possessed had never been the gold he accepted or the influence he chased. It had been the trust of the one person who had loved him without asking for anything in return, and that was the one thing no amount of wealth could ever buy back. The next full moon rose above Blackwood Citadel like a silver promise finally fulfilled. Lanterns illuminated the palace gardens while every path leading toward the ancient oak tree was lined with white flowers that shimmered beneath the evening sky. Nobles, servants, scholars, and visitors gathered together without the usual divisions that had separated them for generations. For the first time in many years, the atmosphere felt lighter, as though the kingdom itself had been waiting for this quiet night. Evelyn Carter stood beneath the great oak, wearing a simple ivory gown chosen not for luxury but for elegance. Around her neck rested the crescent moon medallion that had belonged to her mother, its silver surface reflecting the moonlight with gentle brilliance. She no longer carried the uncertainty that had filled her heart when she first crossed the palace gates. She had discovered that her worth had never depended on another person's approval. It had always lived inside the kindness she offered even when life gave her every reason to become bitter. Adrian Blackwood walked toward her with calm, unhurried steps, dressed in the formal colors of the royal house. The moment their eyes met, the sounds of the gathered crowd seemed to fade into the distance. He smiled with a warmth few people had ever witnessed from their reserved king. "For years," he said softly, "I searched distant kingdoms because I believed dreams were pointing me somewhere beyond my reach. I never imagined destiny would arrive at my own gate carrying more courage than anyone I had ever known." Evelyn looked up at him, her amber eyes shining beneath the moonlight. "I spent so long believing I had lost my home," she answered. "Now I understand that home was never a place. It was the people who would choose me without asking me to become someone else." Adrian gently took her hands in his. The instant their fingers touched, both of them saw the same meadow one final time. The lonely boy beneath the ancient oak smiled as the little girl placed a crown of white flowers upon his head. This time neither of them disappeared with the sunrise. The memory slowly dissolved into the present, leaving only peace where unanswered questions had once lived. Theodore Hawthorne quietly lowered his head with grateful relief. The oldest prophecy had never been about power conquering kingdoms. It had always been about compassion healing hearts. Even Nathan Carter stood among the gathered guests, watching silently with humbled eyes. He knew forgiveness would take time, but for the first time he chose to celebrate someone else's happiness instead of comparing it to his own. Adrian lifted Evelyn's hand with quiet reverence. "I cannot promise a life without challenges," he said. "But I promise that your voice will always be heard, your choices will always matter, and your kindness will never stand alone again." Evelyn smiled through grateful tears before answering with calm certainty. "Then wherever tomorrow leads, we will walk there together." As applause gently echoed through the gardens, thousands of white flower petals drifted from the ancient oak, carried by a warm mountain breeze across the gathered crowd. Many would later remember the beauty of that moonlit evening, but those who truly understood its meaning remembered something far greater. The strongest kingdom is never built by fear. It is built by people who choose dignity over pride, compassion over bitterness, and love that honors another person's freedom above all else.